Hello, and welcome to our weekly live dialogue with Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the founder and chairwoman of the Schiller Institute. Today is July 27th, 2023. I'm Harley Schlanger, and I will be your host. You can send us your questions and comments at questions@schillerinstitute.org. Well, Helga, with NATO's war continuing in Ukraine, and the ever more provocative actions being undertaken by the Ukrainian armed forces under direct NATO supervision, there's been positive momentum building for the August 6th demonstrations called for by the International Peace Coalition and Humanity for Peace. Since you've played a crucial role in organizing for these demonstrations, can you give us a report on why you see the increasing urgency at this moment for people to turn out and organize for these events?
Well, I think that there are many senior analysts and people with a lot of political experience who all agree they're not the mainstream or they're not covered by the mainstream, that what is the most frightening about the situation is that we are moving closer and closer to a nuclear war, and that the politicians seem to be completely oblivious. They seem not to care about the danger which we are in. The majority of the population is sleepwalking. They're more concerned now about holiday, going vacationing. But the reality is that, we are really getting closer to the war because, the Ukrainian famous counteroffensive clearly is not functioning. This is now being admitted even by the mainstream media in the West. And, recently new developments are on the horizon, which, point to a possible escalation of the war. One being that Putin, among other Russian officials, somehow reported that there are signs that Polish troops are moving closer to the border of Ukraine, and that there is a possibility that, under certain circumstances, Polish troops would move into the western Ukraine. And Putin referenced the relevant historical precedences where this has happened in a similar fashion already in the past. And then there is a very important Indian senior analyst who is warning that, the danger is that the Black Sea is being targeted to be controlled by NATO more and more. The pretext, being the grain ships and all kinds of other things. But, the Black Sea historically was regarded as the backyard or, territory of Russia, or before that the Soviet Union. So, while the West is saying, no, NATO is not moving to the east, this is all not true, it's all a Russian imagination. But if you look at it, there were the 6 NATO expansions to the east. De facto, NATO is in Ukraine right now for, a variety of technical and cyber and whatnot reasons. And, if NATO would now move also into the Black Sea, having more control there, it's an encirclement. And, given the fact that, the Ukraine war, as we have always stressed, is not the real reason why all of this is happening, but it is the fact that the Western system cannot accept that the countries of the global South, including China, emphatically, are rising, and they're trying to contain Russia and China. And in a certain sense, the Ukraine situation is the pawn on the chessboard for that. The danger is very, very clearly escalating. And, given the fact that a little mistake or a misreading could already be sufficient to trigger the catastrophe, people who have studied the matter and who are thinking clearly are extremely concerned about the danger of World War III and the end of human civilization. But the majority of the people seem to not care, as if nuclear war would be something, you may have it or not, doesn't matter. And this nonchalance is is really what is the biggest danger in the whole situation. So therefore, the International Peace Coalition and many other organizations, for that matter, are mobilizing around the anniversary of the bombing on Hiroshima, and to a certain extent on the 6th of August and on the 9th of August Nagasaki, but especially on the 6th, to have as many powerful demonstrations around the world as possible. Now, the International Peace Coalition is trying to make a big showing in front of the United Nations. So I'm calling on all of you who are watching this program, if you are close to New York City, or you have any way of going there on August 6th to the rally in front of the United Nations, please go, take all your friends and colleagues and show there in a big demonstration against the danger of nuclear war, reminding people the horrors of Hiroshima. Now, fortunately, the movie Oppenheimer just opened in, I think, several languages. I know for sure in English and in German. And reports are that there are thousands of people, streaming into the movie theaters, especially young people. And obviously, I mean, this is a way of tapping into a sense of reality, because if people watch this movie, they are reminded of what happened in the terrible tragedy of Hiroshima, and that this must never happen again. So we are mobilizing with the International Peace Coalition. There are people in Latin America, the sister rallies in Mexico, I think in Argentina, maybe in other Latin American countries, but also in Europe. We have rallies in different European cities, and naturally there are sister rallies in various American cities. If you go on our website or go on the Humanity for Peace website, you can find all the information. You can find a leaflet. Please download the leaflet and distribute it through social media in your neighborhoods. Put it in the letterboxes of people around where you live. So get involved in a really very, very important mobilization, because people have to wake up that danger is very real, and this must become a powerful sign of resistance against this insanity.
We're speaking with Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the founder and chairwoman of the Schiller Institute, and she'll take your questions at schillerinstitute.org. Helga, one suggestion that people have made is that the leaflet on the August 6th demonstration, Israel, Sudan, etc., as Ukraine and Taiwan keep heating up, are we in a British orchestrated strategy of tension globally?
Well, I think that's a fair description, because, all of these so-called proxy situations, like in Syria, for example, where, the Syrian army recently has made moves to basically get across to the American troops that they have no point in being there, given the fact that Syria is a sovereign country. They have never asked the United States to come there. And in the area where the US troops have been basically, settling down for some years now, there are the oil reserves, and the United States is transporting oil which belongs to Syria out of the country. And, this is, clearly not acceptable. And you have similar situations which are also heating up appropriately. So I think, all of this must be seen as one strategic picture, because, as I said, the real reason for all of this is not the regional conflict, as important as they are. Even, Syria has issues which are extremely relevant, or Sudan, Taiwan, obviously. But the real reason is what they call the systemic rivalry between the Western neoliberal system, which sticks to the idea that they are the only ones who can make the rules of the world in the so-called rules-based order, and that the majority of the world has nothing to say, and they should also not demand too much development because their place is still in the neo-colonial order. And that is the real issue. So, if you look at it from that standpoint, I really think we are in it's very difficult to say because the financial system is de facto already as good as dead. And, the present desperation of the central banks to again go for increases in interest rates, which, immediately threatens new collapse series. I mean, the economy, the financial system, they are in such an incredible tense situation. We may see a new really big crisis coming September at the end of the fiscal year. And that is really the background of the whole thing, because at the same time, the efforts of the BRICS countries and BRICS Plus, there are reports now that more than 40 countries have applied for BRICS membership because they want to have a different economic system which allows for their own economic development. And the fact that NATO or the West, under the British-US dominance, don't want to allow that rise of these countries, that is the real conflict. Instead of cooperating, I mean, would it be so difficult to reach out and say, let's just put back things behind us, let's think of how we get to the real problems of the world and work together? I mean, there were periods in US-Russian history where the two countries worked together very well. So there is a reference point. So I think that is what we have to evoke and work towards.
On this question of a new paradigm we have from a regular correspondent, wanted to know your thoughts on the progress towards both the BRICS summit, but also the ongoing Russia-Africa forum taking place in St. Petersburg.
Well, the tension around both the BRICS summit, which comes up in late August, and also the ongoing Africa-Russia summit in St. Petersburg, the tension around that is really high. Because, for example, the German, I don't even remember what her post is, it's so irrelevant, German Minister of Environment, I think she is, I may be mistaken. She said, this summit in St. Petersburg, this is just a PR event for Putin. Now, how arrogant can you be? I mean, here are, admittedly, at the last Russia-Africa summit a couple of years ago, there were 43 heads of state. This time it's only 21 heads of state, but 17 vice presidents or foreign ministers and then 5 ambassadors. Why? Because the United States and the Europeans have been running around in Africa, making maximum pressure on these countries, threatening them, offering things, telling them not to go, at least not with the level of heads of state, to the summit in St. Petersburg. And given the fact that many African countries are not exactly in the, they have economic problems, they have difficulties, so they're not all in a position to counter these pressures. Nevertheless, it is an incredible event, and first of all, it makes very clear that Putin is everything but isolated, because as we know from many discussions with African countries, they regard Russia as a friend, they regard China as a friend, and, it's a completely different relationship these African countries have with Russia and China than they have with the Europeans or the United States. So, but what this reflects is I would say, rather desperate move, in the last moment to prevent this new coalition from coming into being. But I don't think they will succeed at all, because what Russia is offering is real economic development, real technology like nuclear technology. China, for that matter, is offering all kinds of infrastructure projects and railroads and industrial parks. And, so I think that the West should reform. They should really abandon this idea that their way is the only way or the highway, my way or the highway. That attitude is really a matter of the past and should stop.
Now, there's a question about the emergence of a new economic and development architecture. Someone asks about, with the BRICS summit coming up, are the BRICS countries adopting the kind of credit-based system that you and your late husband had proposed, as well as banking regulation? And if they haven't, shouldn't they do so?
Well, I think they are in the process of doing exactly that. I think that the fact that, for example, Dilma Rousseff, the new head of the New Development Bank, the former Prime Minister of President of Brazil, Dilma Rousseff, is participating in the St. Petersburg meeting. I think is very important. And there are many other signs and statements by people who are involved in putting such a new economic system and a new currency together. I think they are absolutely doing it. However, obviously, this is not something you do overnight. You have to consider a lot of factors, like the different level of economic development, the different means of production. What is the creditworthiness of each country in terms of productive powers? All of that has to be calculated and put into a very clear balanced system. But I think this is going on, and that may turn out to be the anchor of salvation for the Western financial system, because we are going into a huge financial crisis. There is no question about it. But what will count then is physical assets. And those countries who have invested in physical assets, in infrastructure, in production capacity, they will be the better ones off. And those who have put their entire fortune on betting on financial gains and maximization of profits, that may all go out of the chimney, because the derivative bubble, which goes anywhere in the direction of 2 quadrillion outstanding derivative debt, there is no way how this can ever be paid. So we are heading towards a financial crash, and the more quickly the countries of the West would say, let's reorganize this bankrupt system. Let's introduce Glass-Steagall banking separation, bring our economies in order, go back into the direction of investment in physical economy, and then join with the global South countries. That would be the way out, but it would require to come down from the high horse.
On that topic, there's just been published on one of the BRICS newsletters a memo written by two of our colleagues, Dennis Small and Mary Jane Freeman, on precisely this issue of the kind of economic reforms and transformations that are necessary for the development perspective that you and your husband have been the champion of for so many years. That should be available on our website or in the next issue of the Executive Intelligence Review. Now, I have a question here from Patricia, who asks about with the Black Sea grain embargo, the failure to renew the agreement, and other kinds of problems with food supplies. Can you speak about the short-term implications of what's happening in terms of the global hunger situation?
Yes, I think that the issue of food security and amplify food production is a subject at the summit in St. Petersburg. Now, the West has been going absolutely in a hyper attack against Putin, in particular, that he cancelled the prolongation of the Black Sea grain agreement. And they completely distort this as if it would be the sarcasm of Putin to play with the life of hundreds of millions of people who now will be cut off the Ukrainian grain. Now, the reality of it is that the argument which has been made by the Russians is that this famous grain agreement was absolutely never implemented because the Ukrainian grain, only 5% of that went to the hungry countries in Africa and other continents, while the majority of that grain went into the EU or other rich countries. And the neighbor countries like Poland and Czechia and Czech Republic, they basically wanted to block the export of Ukrainian grain because it did not go to the poor countries, but it would flood their markets and therefore bankrupt their farmers. So the whole thing was a completely different story than it was portrayed by the Western media. And the Russians never were allowed to export their grain and fertilizer, which had been part of the original agreement, but they were absolutely blocked. So then at that point, Russia said there is no point to continue the agreement as it was not being implemented. And I'm absolutely sure that they are working on some alternative way to get the actual grain, at least that from Russia, to the countries in need, especially since Russia offered a lot of this grain to be given for free. So the accusation that it was all for Russia's profit and that they were stealing Ukrainian grain was absolutely not the case. So this is a typical example for the absolute, I mean, when I'm listening, for example, these days, and I'm doing it against, I'm not doing it for pleasure. I'm only doing it to keep track with what the mainstream media are doing. For example, to the German, more or less official, almost government-related radio, Deutschlandradio, there is not one news which they don't give a twist. It is unbelievable. And once you know what's going on and then you listen how they are trying to, immediately counter everything which is happening in the positive direction, trying to smear it, it is mind-boggling.
Well, on the question of the narratives, we have someone who asked about cluster munitions, who writes that the Western media and the Democrats and the Republicans in Congress are justifying their use, Biden's delivery of cluster munitions to Ukraine, by saying that Russia is using them. And this person is asking, do you know if that's true, or is that just another one of these self-justifying lies?
Well, I'm not entirely sure if Russia used some cluster bombs or not. I don't think so, but I have to pass the answer to that question. What I can say is that this cluster bomb issue is even if Russia would use it, it would not justify for the United States to use it. I think Biden has announced, and they will altogether send 300 million cluster bombs. Now that is more than was used in the entire, Vietnam war, and there, basically the governments are still, in the context of the present cluster bomb deliveries, came out and said that after more than 50 years, every year hundreds of people are being killed or, maimed, and that it's absolutely, because it hits civilians, it hits people who have absolutely nothing to do with the war. And it raises another question, which I don't have found a good answer. It is reported every year that the US military budget goes up and up and up. And it was, the latest one is it's almost $1 trillion. Last year it was a little bit less, but not much less. Now, how comes that a country which has a military budget which is bigger than the 10 countries after it together is not able to produce the ammunition to keep up with the Russian army? The Russian budget is, a tiny percentage of the Russian military budget is, I think, 10% of the US military budget. The Russian economy is obviously much smaller. I mean, I don't get it. What is wrong with the Western production that they can't keep up with producing the ammunition? Not to say that they should, but it's a fact that Biden says that they can't. I think this is extremely ominous. And, there are also many warnings that a lot of the weapons are showing up all over the international weapons illegal markets. So who knows what is happening there, but it's a very ominous thing for sure.
Now, Helga, here's a question from another listener asking about the visit of the 100-year-old Henry Kissinger to China and his meeting with Xi Jinping. Did his visit indicate a shift in the position of the United States toward China?
Well, I don't know. I mean, it is a fact that President Xi Jinping received Kissinger obviously with great honor and, praised the fact that it was Kissinger who in 1971, opened the diplomatic or started to prepare the diplomatic relations with China, and that China obviously is thankful and grateful for this role. Now, I think it is good at this point that he did that. Do I trust Kissinger as a result? No, I don't, because, Kissinger was in many, many areas the absolute contrary to my late husband, Lyndon LaRouche. And, the fact that Kissinger went to China in 1971 was not pure humanity. It was basically to counter geopolitically the Soviet Union at that time, or trying to make such machinations. And I'm not entirely sure what is the intent of Kissinger at this point when he is going to China, given the fact that there were so many people who were either trying to get Russia to break with China or to get China to break with Russia. So one has to look at it with very careful eye. If there is a faction inside the United States who would be behind Kissinger, trying to, start to put out feelers, that could be only welcomed. But Kissinger, many people, when they get very old, tend to renounce their sins they committed in earlier years. That may be a case of that. I don't know. So let's see.
Well, that would be a very long confession if Kissinger decided to do that. I have one more question for you, Helga, which is on the ongoing U.S. election campaign. It's from a listener in Australia who said that from what they see, it looks like there's a very desperate effort to stop the candidacies of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and Donald Trump. In the case of Kennedy, there's censorship, there's slander, there's lying about his positions. In the case of Trump, there's one indictment coming after another. And the person asks, will this work, or will the American people see through this?
Well, I think more and more people start to see through this because, I think Trump is way ahead of his opponents in the Republican Party. DeSantis is, way, way behind, and others are even less prominent. So I think Trump will for sure be a factor. Even if they would put him in jail, he would be a factor. So I think that's very useful because, Trump brings in certain positions which are much, much, much healthier than anything you can see in the mainstream political panorama. And Robert Kennedy is, speaking out in an amazingly fresh and honest way. And I think, there are many strata in the United States who look at the situation and they're not born yesterday. Like, for example, when you have somebody like this Schulz-Wassermann congresswoman, who is slandering Robert Kennedy, for example, people will remember that she was the one who totally, came in favor of Hillary Clinton against Bernie Sanders. And, Bernie Sanders obviously didn't have the courage or backbone or whatever to stand up against this, which left a lot of his supporters completely disappointed. So the political scene in the United States is clearly in a turmoil. The fact that the economic situation of many Americans is not going well for sure will increase the suspicion against anything coming from inside the Beltway. And, therefore, I think the fact that you have a real candidate on the Republican side with Trump, and you have a very promising candidate with Robert Kennedy on the Democratic side, and you have relevant independent campaigns like that of Diane Sayre running for Senate in New York, I think this makes altogether a much more hopeful political spectrum that maybe one day a real election campaign can return to the United States, because it has not been one for the last several election turns. So, but that's not a question of just contemplating about. This is a question of becoming active. And even if you are not an American, you can help the process by participating in the August 6th worldwide peace demonstrations. Even if you're only one person, or maybe you can get 5 together and you go in front of the city council or in front of some other notable place in your country, in your city, do it. I think we are aiming to get as many countries or people in as many countries as possible to come out and, make sure that there is a knowledge about a growing worldwide peace movement. So get active, even if you're sitting in Australia or some other very far away place. I'm speaking from the standpoint of Germany at this point. Do it, because it's so much at stake. And I think the more people come out and express their will for peace, it will also impact the United States, because we have to get so strong that the people who are normally not thinking, the mainstream people who are addicted to stupid TV shows or don't care about the world at all, they have to realize that there is a danger and there is a growing movement to counter it.
I mean, one sign of the absurdity of U.S. politics is that Wasserman Schultz, who you mentioned, the congresswoman, tried to censor Robert F. Kennedy Jr. from testifying before a congressional committee. The topic of the committee was the censorship in politics. Now, Helga, one final question I have for you from a member of the International Peace Coalition wants to know what you think is the way to keep nuclear weapons from getting into the possession of terrorist organizations.
Well, that is obviously a big danger, because you not only have the nuclear arsenals of the big nuclear powers, or the 5 nuclear powers who are in the UN Security Council, but you have, Pakistan, Israel. There's always the danger that that proliferation of these weapons or these technologies could happen, and they could get in the hands of terrorism. That is and will be for some time a very big danger. Now, the only way how we can eliminate that danger is, you cannot stop scientific progress. You cannot stop you cannot undo the fact that the atom was discovered. You cannot undo nuclear energy or nuclear weapons. But what you can do is you can mobilize the political will, because everything always depends on the people who are using these technologies. And my late husband, Lyndon LaRouche, had this absolutely brilliant idea of a new paradigm among the superpowers, which was the idea which then became the SDI, which is very misunderstood because it has been misrepresented by the mass media so much. But it basically was the idea that the United States and the Soviet Union at the time should have worked together, and I'm emphasizing work together, to develop technologies to make nuclear weapons obsolete together, and then use these technologies as a science driver to basically increase the productivity of both economies for a huge technology transfer to the developing countries, stop the idea of the blocks, and with that stop the idea of using these countries as proxy wars in proxy wars. That was all on the table for 1 full year, and President Reagan made it the official policy of the United States on the 23rd of March 1983. Now that program was never realized because the opposition, also in the United States, but also in the Soviet Union, went completely on the barricades. And so the program was really never quite, was not realized. But it would be the way to go. In the same way, like classification, is really, in a certain sense, stupid, because it would be much better to come to a peaceful, cooperative approach among all scientists of the world to work, to make these technologies obsolete, to, basically make all scientific discoveries known to everybody, and that way not prevent the progress of each single country on this planet. Now that requires trust which is completely gone at this point. But, I think that, the idea that you can sort of de-risk or decouple and put, bans on other scientists from other countries knowing about these things, it's completely ridiculous. It has never functioned, and the entire evolution of the human species to the present day is the proof that you cannot put science and technology into jail, because it is the ability of man to discover new physical principles all the time. And the question is, how can we educate human beings to be human, to not use these things for destructive purposes, but to use them for the benefit of humanity? And, that comes emphatically to the issue of the image of man. If you think that man is good by nature and that sin is only the reason of a lack of development, then you think you can accomplish what I'm saying. And if you think man is a beast and man is evil and must be contained by a strong police apparatus, then you naturally think this can never happen. But that is really the underlying battle we are engaged in right now, because these are problems, like what do you do with the existing nuclear weapons and how can you prevent proliferation? These are the issues which can only be solved in a trustful environment, which is why I have said so emphatically that we need a new international security and development architecture where trust-building measures are being reinstituted, and that we get out of this completely insane and bestial geopolitical confrontation, which can only end up with the destruction of us all. So that may not be a complete answer to your question, but it should give you some sort of some food for thought.
Well, we've come to the end now, Helga, and I would urge people who want to become part of the International Peace Coalition, and of course, everyone watching this should want to. We have plenty of material on it at theschillerinstitute.com, including press releases on the ongoing meetings taking place and the leaflets that you can download and distribute, and what you can do to become active with this. So go to theschillerinstitute.com. Helga, thanks for joining us this week. And I guess I'll see you again next week.
Yes, till next week.